Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to cover the Nimzowitsch Defense, and as opposed to other openings I have been going over, this one is only going to be one video. It's not that it's that much simpler than, let's say, the Philidor or some other openings which I have covered, but it has definitely less theory, so it's going to be one long video. And this will be the last E4 opening I cover. So the series is finally over, and from tomorrow I'm going to start the endgame series and the D4 series, starting with the King's Indian. Okay, so the Nimzowitsch Defense is somewhat of a surprise always, and I remember one of my opponents, Medak, who I have faced in the Croatian Cup now, he almost always plays the Pirc, but sometimes he plays the Nimzowitsch Defense. So I was pretty worried because I had no idea how to play against it, and it was for him, for the game against him, that I prepared some lines with white against the Nimzowitsch Defense. And I have to say, most of the variations lead to white being better, and that is fairly logical. Okay, we are going to look at three moves for white. Knight f3, knight c3 and d4. In my experience, most lower rated players choose the move d4, and on the highest levels knight f3 is by far the most popular move. So okay, the opening, by the way, was of course named after Aaron Nimzowitsch, one of the greatest players of all time. Not that he played it as often, but he did play it. Okay, so we have e4, and black goes against every single chess principle probably with the move knight c6. This move is counterintuitive, it doesn't develop the king side, doesn't help black castle, doesn't take the center, doesn't go for a hyper-modern approach with d6 or g6, doesn't really follow any train of chess thought which makes some sense. So the move knight c6 is definitely unusual. Now, as I said, white has three main responses, knight f3, knight c3 and d4. On the first glance, d4 might be the most sensible move, simply taking up the center and controlling a lot of key squares, c5, d5, e5 and f5, and threatening in some positions the move d5. But that's perhaps exactly what black is counting on, because the move d4 is always going to be met by either d5 or e5, in which case white is going to have to sort of give up his cards to black and tell him what the central structure is going to be like. So after the move d4, even though you seemingly have a spatial advantage, black can actually undermine your center later on, because you are going to commit to something. So let's say d4, e5, you can either take, you can push, you have a decision to make. So if you are unprepared and you are playing against an experienced player with the black pieces who plays the Nimzowitsch Defense, then you could find yourself in trouble easily. One thing that I would like to mention about the opening is that it's immensely transpositional, and even though it doesn't transpose to the exact same positions sometimes, you often get a feel that you are playing a well-known opening. For example, in some variations, you can enter the advanced Caro-Kann with the black pawns on e6, d5 and c6, and the bishop outside of the pawn chain on f5. After some positions in which white plays knight f3 and black plays e5, you enter a normal king's pawn opening, and you can continue with the Spanish, Italian, Scotch or whatever. You can transpose directly into the Scotch, you can transpose into the Vienna game, the Max Lange attack. In some positions you can enter the Pirc defense. So let's say white plays d4 here, black plays d6, and knight c3, knight f6, you have a weird Pirc defense, or even the Philidor. So the Nimzowitsch Defense can end up being several different openings, which is what makes it a dangerous weapon to have in your repertoire, and it makes it an opening which inexperienced players won't have an easy time against, because there are vast possibilities, several different types of structures which you could play. The plans for both sides aren't really that clear. There are a lot of pawn breaks and it's complicated. So if you are looking for a complicated opening to play against a lower rated player, this could be ideal. And if you are playing somebody much higher, the Nimzowitsch Defense is also a great choice, because you can literally memorize the theory, and the player you're up against definitely won't know as much, and he might get confused. Okay, so first I would like to mention that from this position, from knight c6, knight f3 is by far the most popular move, over 3000 games. d4 has only been played 1400 times, knight c3 has been played 500 times. So at least when I would face this move in a blitz game, I would lash out with d4 immediately without even thinking. Basically thinking that it has to be the best move. But it's quite different. After knight f3, white scores 40% of the time, black scores 26% of the time, so it's not that the opening is bad for black, it's not that black doesn't have chances. And with d4, the scoring is somewhat similar, white scores 39%, so you could go for either one. Let's go for knight f3 first. This is the so-called declined variation. You're basically declining the move d4, hence the name. And now black gets to choose what he's going to do. Of course, from this position, black can choose the move e5. And after e5, you have a normal king-pawn game where you can play bishop c4, bishop b5, d4, whatever. You enter a normal king's pawn. And probably the player who plays the Nimzowitsch defense isn't going to play e5 here. Okay, so there are two options. The move knight f6 isn't really good. It would lead to a bad variation of the Alekhine defense, and it shouldn't really be played. The two moves that black has at his disposal are d6 and d5. d6 is slightly less aggressive and the main line, and d5 is more aggressive and the sideline, which is venomous, but if white knows what he is doing, he should be better. So let's look at d5 first. d5. After d5, white only has one good move, basically taking the pawn. If you allow d4, then black might get in e5 and get a favorable central structure and a spatial advantage, so you take this. And the point is that after queen takes d5, you play the move knight c3, and now you have an improved variation of the Scandinavian for white. And as I said, the opening is hugely transpositional, and it pays off to know e4 theory, because whatever you play, it's going to resemble a normal e4 opening, if you understand what I'm trying to say. So this is a Scandinavian, basically. After e d5, queen d5, knight c3, with the moves knight c6 and knight f3 interposed, which can actually happen very often in the knight f3 Scandinavian. So in this position, black has to put the queen somewhere. The most popular move is same as in the Scandinavian, queen a5. And now white continues with bishop b5. After bishop b5, you're pinning the knight. Black unpins, you castle. Black plays a6, chasing the bishop away. And the best move is actually to take. Bishop takes, bishop takes. And now white goes for the thematic Scandinavian move d4. And after d4, black castles. If you're unfamiliar with the Scandinavian theory, you should definitely watch the video on that. If you play the Nimzowitsch defense, and especially if you play it on a higher level, then you are going to be facing the move knight f3. So it's going to be useful to understand this position. And here white should hold an edge. It's about, I would say, plus 0.5. Let's see what the engine says. Yeah, plus. Yeah, now it's going crazy a bit, more than +1, but it's not really realistic. If you understand the Scandinavian, then white has a slight edge. And black has the plan of playing e5, undermining this structure, and playing normal developing moves. At least black has the bishop pair, and black has put the white knight on c3, which is an awkward square, and it isn't really that useful. White from here on continues with knight e5, threatening the f7 pawn and the exchange. Bishop e8, bishop e3 developing, f6 chasing the knight away, knight d3. Here the engine will say that now it's finally normal, slight advantage for white, and this is the realistic evaluation. The good thing for black is that this position is complicated. You have the bishop pair, you have the semi-open center, your queen is outside of your structure. Okay, you are down in development, but it's definitely playable, opposite side castling. So as I said, if you are looking for an aggressive weapon to fight off lower rated players, or if you are looking for a surprise weapon against high rated players, then this variation after e4, knight c6, knight f3 with d5 should be your weapon of choice. Now the second move after knight f3, and by far the most popular move, is d6. This is the Williams variation, and it's slightly less risky, slightly less committal, and safer basically. But According to the engines and according to theory, white should be better in almost all lines. After d5, black equalizes almost and has an equal but complicated position. After d6, the position is simple, but it's simply better for white. After d6, white should now take up the center with d4. Now the move e5 is going to be met by taking the queen and threatening the f7 pawn. If you remember the Philidor positions, which we have been looking at, let's say e5 takes. If you take with the knight, white is going to take. If you take with the pawn, white is going to take the queen, declining your castle rights, and the best thing you can do is knight d8, and you are down in development. So black continues with the move knight f6. And now you have a Pirc, basically, with the move knight c6 being played and instead of g6. So now we are transposing to a kind of a Pirc position where black doesn't really develop the bishop to g7 that often, but he still might. Okay, white plays knight c3, a move which you play against the Pirc, defending your e4 pawn. Bishop g4, pinning the knight. Bishop e3, normal development. e6. Black can also play e5 here. He can also play g6, but e6 is sort of the safest way to play, creating this Scheveningen pawn structure. And later on, black is going to be looking forward to the move c5. And if black gets c5 in, disrupting white central control, then it's a sort of hyper-modern Sicilian hybrid where black has a lot of chances. h3, bishop h5, d5 now, and white wants to close down the structure, wants to restrain the move c5, wants to prevent black from playing the easy e5 in some positions, and this is where the position gets its true nature. So e takes d5, bishop takes f3 for the tempo move knight e5, queen takes f3, knight e5, queen e2. This is the starting position, and this is vastly superior for white. And if I turn on the engine, it's going to go crazy, almost +2, which is slightly unrealistic because it's equal material, and I would say that black's development is slightly better. But white has more space because of the d5 pawn. White has the bishop pair, and these knights, even though they seem good in the center, can be misplaced with moves such as f4, g4, g5, and they don't really have that many squares. So this variation I wouldn't recommend for black, and I think this is perhaps why most strong players choose the move knight f3, so after e4, knight c6. They don't get tempted to commit in the center with d4, they continue with knight f3, knowing that they could play the normal Roy Lopez or the Italian, but they count on the move d6, which the Nimzowitsch Defense player is almost always going to play. So after d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, bishop g4 is the only logical move here you have to develop, bishop e3, you can also continue with bishop e2, but that's sort of unnecessary, and as we saw in the other variations, your queen needs a retreat square, so remember that if you're playing against this variation. As I said, e5 and g6 are also possible, but after g6 you enter a sort of normal Pirc where white has this battery already, and he should be slightly better. Let's say castles queenside, and castles could be met by bishop h6 immediately, and white should be better here, definitely. So yeah, be ready to transpose to a lot of positions with both colors. Okay, now I want to look at the move knight c3 after e4, knight c6, knight c3. Knight c3 is a less complicated move, often transposing to the Vienna game, and which starts e4 and then knight c3. So if black chooses the move e5 here, you have the Max Lange attack. So once again, most Nimzowitsch Defense players are not going to transpose to some mainline openings and well-known stuff. They have probably played knight c6 to confuse you. So after knight c3, you are going to be facing the move knight f6. After knight f6, now is the time to take up the center, because whichever move black makes now after d4, you gain a tempo on the knight. So d4, and black's main move now is d5. d6 can also be played, but that's transposing to the variation we just saw with d6, the Williams variation, and d5. As I said, yeah, after d6, white simply plays knight f3, and we have the Williams variation, which we just saw, which isn't good for black. So black should play d5. This is now the Scandinavian variation by transposition, and the Bogolyubov line in the Scandinavian. White plays e5. After e5, it's obvious that white has more space. It's obvious that black has one single plan in the position, and that's to play the move c5. And I've been contemplating these positions for a while, and I've actually, when I was studying the advanced Caro-Kann, I was looking at pawn breaks and in general, and how to exploit them, how to stop them, and stuff like that. And for these positions, I was looking at the move bishop d3, and then playing the move knight e2. After you play knight e2, your goal is basically to play the move c3. If you can also get b4, then c5 is never happening. So let's just look at the position. The main move is knight d7. Now, you can go for the main line, which, well, knight takes d5 is the main line, which I don't really recommend. Knight takes d5, and now knight d to b8. White is going to lose the pawn back. Knight e3, queen d4, knight d4, c3, knight e6, g3. It should be better for white, but you once again have an overextended e5 pawn, same as in the Alekhine defense. And black doesn't have the problems he has in the Alekhine defense, so I'm not sure about this. Of course, you can play bishop g2, knight e2, you can castle, and then you can play the move f4. The queens are off the board, so we are going to have pressure along this diagonal, but I'm not sure that's the best way to play. Still, if you want to play as precisely as possible after knight d7, you can continue with knight takes d5, and this should be fairly easy to play. So knight d5, knight d to b8 has to be played, otherwise white is going to defend everything. Knight e3. Defending with c4 doesn't really make much sense because e6 can be played anyway. So knight e3, queen d4, knight d4, chase the knight away with c3, knight e6, and now the best position you can get is g3, bishop g2, getting on this diagonal. And as I said, if I turn on the engine, it's going to be better for white, but nothing major. And with correct play, this position should be a draw. So after the move e5, knight d7, I was looking at interesting positions with f4. So let's say you start with f4. The main move for black here is knight to b6, actually, looking at the c4 square. So let's say the position does continue with knight b6. And now I was looking at knight f3, bishop e3, knight e2, c3. So let's say knight f3. Let's say black plays bishop g4, which should be a logical move. Bishop to d3. Yeah, no, that's losing a pawn now. Wait. Okay, let's say bishop e3 first. E6, bishop d3. Well, let's say bishop e7, knight e2. And this is the position which I like. And I think that these structures, even though if you turn on the engine, it's going to say that it's completely equal, as it always is in these complicated positions, I think that this is irrelevant as well. And I'm actually happy to have this happen because I'm going to play f5 and take or something. So these positions should be equal, but much easier to play for white because white now has a clear plan. He's stopping black's pawn break, and he has a pawn break of his own. He's going to open up the position. This check as well, I mean, just play knight g3, it doesn't really matter. So this is one idea of how you can complicate matters in the Scandinavian variation, in this transpositional Scandinavian variation. And the idea is basically that after knight c3, knight f6, d4, d5, e5, you need to start thinking about pawn breaks. The Nimzowitsch defense is one of those openings where whoever gets the pawn break in first, whoever manages to open up the position where it's favorable for his pieces, he's going to be better. So even though these equalish lines with the queen exchange are technically the best according to the engines, I think that, okay, depending on your opponent, you want to get the complex position where you know you are going to get the first pawn break or the better pawn break or the more dangerous pawn break or whatever. So this position is a perfect example of that. So knight c3 is the move that I would choose now. And if when I was preparing against Medak, I was looking at these positions with knight c3, and I was actually planning to play after e4, knight c6, knight c3. I wasn't expecting him to play e5. I thought he wouldn't want an equal position. I was expecting knight f6, and I got this far, knight d7, and I was going to play the move f4, and this was my idea, the exact position which I have shown you, which is equal according to the engines, but here I I think it's easier to play for white. This check is irrelevant. It doesn't matter at all. You can castle either side, you can give up your bishops, it doesn't really matter. You're going to play f5, and after f5, you're either going to have an almost passed pawn, or you're going to take, and then you're going to play f4, f5 once again. So I was looking at these positions, and I was really happy. So my advice, if you face knight c6 and you don't know what to do, play knight c3. I think it's the simplest variation to play for white, and regardless of which continuation you choose, you should hold a slight edge, at least from a practical perspective. Okay, now let's look at the critical move. The critical move is, of course, d4. Okay, d4 is sort of the Nimzowitsch defense, which we all know and play, and on the lowest levels, of course, and the lower levels, our levels, d4 is the move that you are going to face most often. And if you play the Nimzowitsch already, this is probably what you see in 80% of your games. We are going to look at two moves, two logical moves here. No other move has been played really. d6 has been played, but that's a variation I mean, after knight c3, you have a bad variation of the Pirc once again, which we saw already. So after knight f3, you have the same position we just saw, and white is, as we know, better in these lines. So the critical variations are not playing d6 definitely. Black, if he wants to achieve his goal in the Nimzowitsch, which is to complicate matters and push white in the center to make sure he commits a pawn structure which black can then attack, black has to play either e5 or d5. d5 is the Scandinavian variation. After e5 we have a position similar to what we just saw, but the knight isn't on f6 already. So it's not really the same. After e5 the knight doesn't have to go to d7, so it's slightly different. And white now has three options. One of them is to play e5, which is here slightly inferior. White can also continue with knight c3, simply defending the pawn. White can play e takes d5. After knight c3, which is the most popular move, the position continues in a very forcing manner with d takes e4. Of course, you are not going to recapture, giving up a pawn. That would be just absurd. So you play d5. After d5, you are pushing the knight further away. The knight can go to e5, and that's probably the best move. Knight b8 can also be played, but I think that e5 is a better square. What's interesting is that knight b8 scores better for black, but I think that's because it's more complicated. I would recommend one game, if you want to look at it. Ivan Sokolov versus Živoslav Nikolic, played in 1988. You can look it up in ChessBase or on Lichess or wherever. So Ivan Sokolov versus Nikolic Živoslav. That was a very interesting game. Black won. So okay, we are going to be looking at the move knight e5. After knight e5, the position is once again fairly forcing. Queen d4, threatening to take the pawn and chasing the knight away. Knight g6, now white gets his pawn back. Queen takes e4, and now knight f6, a tempo on the queen. Queen a4, check, to make sure you don't lose your turn by simply moving the queen. And after queen a4 check, black's best attempt is bishop d7. Bishop b5, and now a6, bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, queen takes d7, knight takes d7, and this position should be slightly better for white, in my opinion. Firstly, you have more space because of the d5 pawn. It's not really such a liability because it's not easy to attack it, and you can also play a move such as knight e4 and c4. And yeah, you have better pieces. You are two moves away from castling either side. White can castle queenside, but if he castles queenside, this pawn majority could put his king under a lot of pressure. And it's equal and playable. And as I said, I think that d4 is an inferior move for white, and that black can get a perfectly playable position in all lines, and this is one example of that. White should hold a slight edge, but it's nothing major. 10 games have been played from this position. White won 3, black won 2, 5 games were draws, so you can see that it's pretty even. The main move is knight f3 here. So this is the position after e4, knight c6, d4, d5, knight c3. And this is the main move. If you want to have a slightly more complicated position, you can play the move e5. And after e5, black plays knight f5. I'm sorry, bishop f5, because he wants to play the move e6. And after bishop f5, c3, e6, you have the advanced Caro-Kann position with the knight on c6 instead of the pawn, and with white having played c3 already. And this is something I'm very comfortable in, because I play the Caro-Kann and they play against the Caro-Kann. So I would once again like to come back to the point that if you are preparing against the Nimzowitsch defense, or if you are playing the Nimzowitsch defense, you should choose a variation which suits your style or which you are familiar with. So for example, if I played the move d4 against the Nimzowitsch and my opponent played the move d5, I would almost certainly continue with the move e5, because I know that black has to play bishop f5. I play c3, he plays e6, and I have a lot of ideas how to exploit the fact that the pawn isn't on c6 but the knight is, and that the knight cannot go to d7. So I would have a lot of fun with this position. So to learn these lines, I would advise you to look at one advanced Caro-Kann game in the main line, and one game from here on, just to understand the differences and to think about how you can exploit the differences in the position. Once again, the engine will tell you that white has a slight edge, plus 0.6. So the position continues with bishop d3, offering a trade, knight g e7 declining, knight e2, queen d7 castles, f6 undermining the structure, once again an idea which you see in the advanced Caro-Kann, and f4, once again an idea which you see for white in the advanced Caro-Kann. And once again you can see that black obviously wants to achieve c5. The difference is that he doesn't have the French defense bishop on c8. The bishop is a Caro-Kann bishop outside of the pawn chain, but still, white has the same advantages he has against the Caro-Kann. And even more so, I would say, because the knight is on c6. So, okay, after d4, d5, the move e5 can be studied by studying the advanced Caro-Kann, and this is probably the best way to do it. And the third move is e takes d5. And this is, this is the Scandinavian defense, just with a different move order. Queen takes d5, knight f3, bishop g4, bishop e2, castle, c4. This is the knight f3 Scandinavian. So if you want to study that, I have made a video on that. I'm going to show you what it looks like. So e5, e4, d5, takes. White doesn't play the tempo gaining knight c3, he plays knight f3. Bishop g4, bishop e2, knight c6, d4, castles, c4, and you have the same, where did it go? You have the same position. So here you have the same position as we saw here, castles, c4, and it's the same. It's the Mises Kotrot's variation of the Scandinavian with knight f3. So after d5, e takes d5 is what you should play if you know how to play against the Scandinavian with knight f3. So that's probably the best advice I could give you. So once again, you have an example of how the Nimzowitsch defense is a transpositional opening, and you can tailor it according to your needs and your abilities and your understanding of some positions. So of course, after d5, if you know how to play against the Caro-Kann with e5, you're going to play e5. After d5, if you know how to play against the Scandinavian with knight f3, you're going to play e takes d5. So e d5, queen d5, knight f3, bishop g4, bishop e2, castle, c4. If black doesn't know the Scandinavian, if he doesn't normally play the Scandinavian, then he is definitely going to be worse from the start, either wasting too much time or blundering something. Okay, now let's look at the second move, e5. This is the Kennedy variation. I have to be honest, I don't know why it's called the Kennedy variation, and I doubt it's after the president. Okay, so three moves here. One move which I would like to discard immediately is the move knight f3. Knight f3 is the Scotch game. If you haven't seen the videos on the Scotch game, please do. This is the Scotch game position. The first move is, instead of knight f3, which has been played on move 2, white now played d4 to enter the Scotch. So if you want to study these positions, look at the videos on the Scotch defense. So d4, e5. Knight f3 is the Scotch game. Two moves which can be played are d5 and d takes e5. d5 is, well, a more committal move It's called the Lynx Springer variation, so the left knight variation, if I am able to translate that correctly. Springer is knight in German and Lynx is left, so the left knight variation. I would guess the queen's knight variation. And this is a more committal move. As I said, committing a central structure which black can then undermine, and from d5 you can see that black is going to want to achieve the move f5, and if he does that, then his position is going to open up and your center is going to crumble. So visually you want to attack on the side where your pawn chain faces. So it's obvious that white wants to play c4 c5 and black wants to play f5 f4. Okay, and the second move after e5 is d takes e5. D takes e5, as in the example that we saw with d5, e takes d5, is less complicated and is more popular. So let's look at d5 first. So e5, d5, committing your pawns in the center. Knight c to e7. And you don't really need to be surprised by this move. It's not that black is worse. This knight is going to have a major role in the center. It helps with the move f5 and it makes perfect sense. White continues with f3. Once again, when I was looking at these positions, I was looking at bishop d3, knight e2 to make sure I can play the move f3 and castle queenside, but it doesn't really work as in the last variation that we saw, so stick to knight f3. Knight g6 is another way for black to play. h4 should be a move that's played to provoke h5, and now bishop g5. Another idea for black after knight f3 is to play the move d6, which I prefer, and if I played this with the black pieces, I would continue with the move d6. And the main idea after d6 is that you want to play the move f5. Okay, but as we said, white wants to play c4, c5, so white can continue with c5 immediately here. Black plays f5, and now we have knight c3, knight f6, and this is the most thematic way to play this variation for black, and this is what I would recommend. The engines think it's worse than the main line with knight g6, but I think from a human perspective this is much simpler, much easier to play, and it gives you more chances. So okay, I would definitely recommend that you study these lines. If you want to be super precise though, after knight f3 you can play the move knight g6, looking at the f4 square, h4, h5, bishop g5, knight f6, knight c3, bishop c5, and the plans are different. Knight d2, c6, undermining the center this way, bishop e2, d6, castles, castles, and now the move after castles. There are several logical moves for black. I really don't know which plan to recommend, which is why I think black should play the variation with f5, but probably a good idea could be to open up the center and get a sort of a Benoni pawn, and whatever you do, let's say you take here, takes, you're going to have problems with your d6 pawn, which is probably the biggest reason why I don't like this variation for black. You're always going to have this weakness on d6 regardless of what happens. Only in the ideal scenario in which you're playing against a white player who is inexperienced, where he takes on c6, you're going to be able to take with the b pawn and have a solid position. So perhaps continue with castling, and white now needs to think about the plan. I think that one plan definitely is to get rid of this bishop, if you can get rid of this bishop, and here I think the move knight a4 is possible, and bishop d4 can of course be met by c3. Once you get rid of this annoying bishop, then the move is f4, and you want to start opening up the lines. So I think that this is much favorable for white, and that black shouldn't really be playing that. So let's look at the position once again. So okay, e4, knight c6, we are looking at d4, e5, and we are looking at the move d5. So d5, knight c7, knight f3, and this is the crossroads in the variation. Knight g6 is what we just looked at. I would really recommend the move d6. You're going to be facing c4, but you can play f5, knight c3, knight f6. And I think this is probably what chess is all about, a position where both sides are trying to attack and undermine their opponent's structure. And these positions I really enjoy playing, and I think that these are great. You can continue with g6, bishop g7. You can continue by moving your knight and trying to castle with bishop e7. It's complex, but it's playable. It's sort of a King's Indian plan, King's Indian type structure, and if you are familiar with the King's Indian, this should be your preferred move. Okay, now we are going to look at e5, d takes e5. D takes e5 is much simpler, of course, and if you choose this with the white pieces, then you are saying that you are not really in a fighting spirit. Black continues with knight e5. F4 isn't really such a strong move here. Knight f3 should be played. It's considered to be better. Knight takes f3, queen takes f3, and black offers a trade with queen f6. White has to decline because it would develop the black knight, so queen g3 is played. Now bishop b4 check, c3, there are no takings here, it doesn't work, the knight is defending. So bishop c5 and now e5. After e5, queen g6, bishop d3 attacking the queen. Black has to take, white recaptures, and d5 is the best move, but black can choose several different moves. And this position is equal, as, I mean, it's completely equal. White has a bit more space, white has a bit better pieces, and all the pieces are open, your rook is developed, but the pawn structure is in black's favor, and you cannot really win this position against an experienced player. So I don't really have much to say about this, but after e4, knight c6, d4, e5, if you continue d takes e5, then you're probably in for a draw, and if you don't know the position, you might even mess up. And knight f3 should be played, black shouldn't retreat, it would be a wasted move, so knight f3, queen f6, white has to decline, queen g3, bishop b4 check is the best move because it provokes c3, which takes away the square from the knight, c3, bishop c5, e5, queen g6, bishop d3 attacking the queen, queen takes, h takes, and now as I said, d5 is the best move with the plan of d5 and en passant. Bishop takes d6 and now knight d2. Equal, even, drawing, and boring, I have to say. So choose the move d5 if you want my advice. After d4, e5, I would recommend the move d5. It's fun to play King's Indian style attacking games, and yeah, just fun. Okay, so these are the variations I wanted to cover. So if you face the Nimzowitsch defense, I would recommend the move knight c3, definitely, and especially if your opponent plays the move knight f6, it's interesting to play. d4 is the most complicated way to play for white, and it doesn't really give you that much of an advantage. So knight f3 should be better than d4, and it is according to Grandmaster games. But still, you have three options, and there's definitely room for a surprise for black, even though he's trying to surprise you with knight c6. In these three moves you can find a ton of ideas and a ton of surprises which black will not know how to respond to. So once again, the main thing, find the variation which resembles the opening you play and study that, trying to find the differences and apply the plans from the openings you know to the Nimzowitsch defense for either color. Okay, so this ends the e4 series. I hope you found it useful. Some sideline openings I'm going to cover after I have finished d4, c4 and knight f3, some openings which aren't really played that often. The playlist is going to be called weird openings or something like that, so anything that's missing is going to be covered then. Until then, yeah, d4 is starting, the endgame series is starting, and I hope you're going to like them. Let me know what you think about the Nimzowitsch defense. Let me know if you play it or face it, and if you have any weapons against it, which I forgot to mention. And stay tuned for more chess. Thank you very much. Bye bye.